Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Jason Swagler was born in Centralia, Illinois. He obtained his bachelor's and master's in music from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, where he is now an assistant professor of jazz saxophone. Welcome to Segue, Professor Swagler.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Well, a question I always ask all the musicians I have had in this show is, the first one is very simple. Why do you become interested in music?
That's a difficult question. I think it just happens naturally. I've always been into music as far back as I can remember. I initially was really into popular music, you know, like a lot of kids. You hear what you're exposed to on the radio, and I wanted to be a rock and roll guitarist. That's kind of was the big spark, you know. So I got an acoustic guitar early on when I was about eight years old, and that was it for me. I had the bug ever since.
So it began rather early in your career, which is pretty common for most musicians to start very early in their life.
Yeah, I think so. At least, you know, banging around on pots and pans, at least at the very minimum, you know. So I was definitely into it. But what killed it for me early on, though, was formal study. You know, being that young, and my mom told me, well, you've got a guitar, now you have to study privately. And that was kind of a bit of a downer for me at that early age, but I loved music ever since I can remember, though, definitely.
So how come do you switch from guitar to saxophone, or were there other instruments in between?
Well, I always, even though I'm known as a saxophonist, I feel like I'm a guitarist trapped in a saxophonist's body. I think that's what I was meant to play, but I always say that the saxophone chose me. A couple family members played saxophone. My uncle Terry played, my great uncle played. The only reason I ended up on saxophone, it was not my choosing. It was the day that you get to try out instruments for the public school band, and the band director selected the saxophone for me. I wanted to play drums. That was closer to rock and roll, right? And he said, well, we've already got enough drummers. Why don't you try the saxophone? And that's how I ended up on saxophone. And I was kind of disappointed when I came home that day and had the sheet that said, you're playing saxophone. But, you know, my parents made the best of it and convinced me that would be a good thing. And fortunately for me, my grandparents had a great saxophone that was my uncle's. And they dusted it off, and that's the same horn I continue to play.
No, you're having actually very difficult to play electric guitar in a marching band.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So it was actually probably a good thing it worked out that way. So.
Okay. Well, saxophone is a very very well-known instrument. Everybody knows about it. Yet when you go to listen to classical music, let's say Beethoven or Mozart, you don't see saxophones. But there is a historical reason for that.
Yeah, the saxophone wasn't invented until the 1840s, I believe. So much of the core classical repertoire was already written before the saxophone was invented. And of course, it takes a long ways for an instrument to become accepted in any field, you know. And the saxophone is still not a full accepted member of the orchestra. You know, there are pieces, of course, that are written that feature saxophone and that include saxophone in them. You know, but definitely not a full-time kind of role.
Mm-hmm. However, I mean, it has become a very popular instrument. What do you think is the reason that made the saxophone to become such an accepted instrument in today's contemporary music?
Well, I believe, you know, especially in contemporary music and popular music, you know, a lot of great instrumentalists have gone a long way towards advancing how to be expressive on the instrument, and they've discovered and taken advantage of the vocal-ish kind of qualities of the saxophone. And it's got a beautiful tone quality in the upper register. The lower register has some really unique, very rich tone qualities, and it can sound really beautiful, and then it can sound very harsh at the same time. So it's got a wide range of expression that I think especially contemporary musicians have really picked up on and taken advantage of.
Well, talking about range, I mean, we know that people talk about the saxophone, but actually there are many, many different types of saxophones depending mostly on the octaves in which they play. Tell us a little bit about that range of instruments that we call saxophones, because even some of them don't even look like a typical saxophone, right?
Right, yeah. Well, there are 4 common saxophones that we have, the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the baritone from highest to lowest. And then you have a variety beyond that that usually you don't see very often. It's kind of rare to see somebody play a sopranino, which is even higher than a soprano. It looks totally like a toy if you saw one. And then there are bass saxophones and contrabass saxophones, which are extremely enormous. We have a bass saxophone here on campus that when there's a piece called upon it, the student usually either looks forward or dreads to get that big monster out, to play it. But it makes quite a scene on stage too.
Now, if you can play one type of saxophone, can you play all the others, or those require a very different type of training?
The fingerings are all exactly the same. Each instrument it's got enough of it to be unique to where you have to spend some time to really get your own voice on individually. But the fingerings are all identical, so if you read music and you know how to push the buttons down, it all transfers exactly across all of the saxophones.
Okay, well, let's now listen to Jason Swagler playing one of his new pieces titled Segment by Charlie Parker on his latest album, Rough Stuff. Okay, well, this has been your latest recording, and you were mentioning to me before the show started to be recorded that this is not being printed on a CD, but it's all out there electronically. I brought here, however, from your website, the cover, so to speak, of the non-existent CD, which is here, so our audience can watch it on the webcam for the show when it is aired, the Monday following this airing on Sunday. And basically, in this piece, you were playing the alto saxophone with Eric Sloffer, at the guitar, Nick Jost at the bass, and Mary Morrison at the drums. That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, how come did you get together with these other musicians to come up with this album?
Well, we've played various shows together through the years, and we're good friends as well. And we decided one summer to kind of just put a project together and play an awful lot. And we met on a weekly basis and just improvised and played through material. And the album is basically a culmination of those experiences through the summer. Towards the end of the summer, we recorded the album, and when we were running on all cylinders at that point, we went into the studio and pretty much the entire album was either first or second takes of tunes, because we were wanting to capture the spirit of the moment, essentially, and not try to overproduce, and just kind of represent what we had been working on, you know, four musicians trying to communicate together, and after those experiences, playing gigs and playing together through that summer, you know, we all came together then.
Now, most of these pieces were written by someone else.
Combination of things. We've everybody contributed at least one or two originals, and then we've got a sprinkling of either jazz standards or tunes that we've selected.
So how do you choose which pieces you got from other composers?
That's a good question. Sometimes it was just something that, you know, one of us brought in that was really appealing. Sometimes we would just play through tunes, and if something seemed to click, we kept it. In fact, we've recorded quite a few tunes over a span of 2 days, and these are just the ones out of that pile that we selected to release. So.
Okay. Now, the title of this album is Rough Stuff. Why that name?
A combination of reasons. A lot of times when we met to play, if it wasn't on a gig, we were meeting at my house, and I live in a very old house in Alton. It's almost 200 years old.
Wow.
And my wife and I were both avid preservationists, and it's always in varying states of rehabilitation. Yeah, right. So that was a little rough. And then that summer as well, we were supposed to perform a weekend at Jazz at the Bistro in St. Louis, and the day before those shows, I got appendicitis and had to have my appendix removed. So that was a rough summer, a little bit.
I'm sure.
Long story short.
Okay. Now, when you spoke earlier about the different types of saxophones, now you play the alto mostly.
That's my main. Yeah.
Why you chose alto?
Well, alto's the one I started on, and I also feel like it's just my voice. I mean, I've played all of the other horns. In fact, next week I'm playing a concert where I have to play flute, tenor sax, and alto. But I always go back to the alto. It just feels like it's my voice. It's home for me.
Okay. Now, I found some diversity in the tracks from bossa nova type of music to more improvisation type of music. Was that made on purpose, or just came out in the spur of the moment?
I think it happens naturally. I mean, there's part of a, you know, when you select material, you know, it's common to search for a variety and have a balance of things. But at the same time, I think it also happens quite naturally. I mean, I just simply pick tunes that I enjoy to play. You know.
Okay. Now, let's listen now to Jason Swagler interpreting a segment of Coro dos Aguas by Ivan Lins. Okay, so that was can we call it the Jason Swagler Quartet, or do you have a specific name for the group?
Well, that group's actually a duo. That's that recording is part of a recording that Darren Jackson, a pianist, and myself recorded a couple months ago. It's not officially released yet. We're mastering it as we speak here now. So we're looking at releasing it in a couple months.
Why do you think that bossa nova, which is a type of Brazilian music, is so adept to be played by jazz performers?
Well, speaking for myself personally, I love the melodies of particularly kind of the contemporary Brazilian music, kind of the hybrid modern samba, bossa nova sound. The harmonies to me are just lush and beautiful, and that speaks to me. And I've heard a lot of jazz musicians also talk about this, that's one of the appealing elements of Brazilian music is the harmonies and the melodicism, the beautiful way that the melodies flow. And then, of course, the rhythms, which are very appealing. Jazz itself has a history of embracing music from South America, whether it's the rhythmic element or the harmonic or melodic. So I think it's a natural fit.
Now, for our audience to have an idea about the production of this type of albums, how long did it take from the time that you decided, let's make an album, to the time it was completed?
Well, the actual physical making of the album happens rather quickly, between a day to 2 days for these recent projects, which are based not as much on overdubbing and production, it's more on capturing us creating in the moment. So we don't spend, like a pop album might take 6 months, a year to make, because they're trying to make everything as perfect as possible, and they're trying to layer track on top of track, where this is more the act of documenting a moment in time where musicians are coming together to create something, and whatever happens essentially. But there is some preparation that goes commonly ahead of time. In the case of these albums, the preparation was either just playing a lot together or gigging a lot together, and then deciding on repertoire and then going into the studio and documenting it.
Now, something I was being intrigued about is jazz, in the sense that jazz is quintessential American. Yet it sounds that jazz is more popular in places like Europe than it is in the United States.
That's true.
Is there any explanation for that?
You know, I don't know if that's human nature. There are a lot of things that are more appreciated away from where they were created, I think. That you see that time and time again, and I think jazz is no different. Most jazz musicians, they don't play around the States as much as they do in Europe and in some Asian countries. And it's because there is a higher level of appreciation in certain areas for this music. It's even rare for jazz musicians to tour in certain parts of the country just because there's not enough of an audience. It's more of a niche kind of thing. Of course, historically it wasn't like that. Jazz was originally very popular music in the 1920s and 1930s and so on. But things always come back around, and the music has evolved, and jazz, the label, there are so many subcategories inside of that it's pretty extraordinary, actually.
There was some hope when the documentarian Ken Burns came up with the series of documentaries about jazz, that there was going to be a renaissance of jazz in this country because it was presented as something that was truly American. Mm-hmm. Yet that did not happen. Yeah, well, there are some elements of in particular modern jazz and popular culture and popular music that I don't think necessarily something like even a well-publicized and popular documentary could have addressed. And that documentary actually polarized jazz musicians as well, because some felt, oh, this is a great thing, and then others felt that, well, this is a misrepresentation of the music we create, or that you focused on these musicians, why didn't you talk about so-and-so? And, and the debate, I guess, continues, for those who are still interested in debating it. It's certain elements of jazz, it takes a little bit of, I don't want to say work, but it does take an element of exposure and appreciation that not everybody gets. And a lot of people listen to music for fun. And sometimes, for whatever reason, some people don't listen to jazz because they don't get that element out of it, and it's like everybody's got different tastes. You can't expect everybody to like everything. But I think that's part of it.
you know, you can appreciate something, but that doesn't mean you want to drive down the road with the top down and the music, you know, it might not serve the same purpose for you.
Okay, now let's listen to Jason Swagler interpreting a segment of Rainy Night by Mary Morrison. Okay, again we're listening to Jason Swagler accompanied by the alto saxophone with Eric Slaughter at the guitar. I'm pronouncing right as last name?
Eric Slaughter, yes.
Lauren, Nick Joss at the bass and Mary Morrison at the drums. Mm-hmm. Did you think about incorporating keyboards at some point in this album?
We kind of thought of it actually, you know, adding another element, but you know, Eric is an amazing guitarist and he's a great accompanist, and frankly we didn't need a piano with all of the things that he could do, you know, but yeah, that adding a piano to the mix would definitely add another color to it, which would be great.
Okay. I noticed reading your resume that one of the courses that you teach is improvisation. Mm-hmm. And some people may think that's an oxymoron to teach improvisation because they think, well, if you know how to improvise, you just know it, you just do it.
Yeah.
But there is a little bit more than that to improvisation. Yeah, can you explain to our audience why improvisation needs to be taught?
Well, a lot of what we address in a improvisation class is more techniques and philosophies on how to get the mind to react in an improvisatory fashion. Of course, we get into specific nuts and bolts, jazz-specific improvising elements, but a lot of what the individual needs in order to learn to improvise is based not only on knowledge but on experience. And so sometimes an improvisation class is just you know, a way to get musicians together to gain that experience through improvising and then talking about what worked and what did not, and then offering suggestions of, well, check out what so-and-so does, and then trying to you know, get inside the philosophy of how we as musicians improvise. People improvise all of the time. You know, we're improvising even though we have the script. We're improvising a dialogue here, and it seems very unnatural if we went to a course designed in how to converse with somebody. And music is a language, so there is an act of conversation. But a lot of it just boils down to having that experience, conversing with people, mm-hmm. and trying to get that dialogue and figuring out what works and what does not through that experience.
Okay. Now, one of the interesting things about the history of jazz are all the personalities involved. I mean, usually all the great jazz musicians have a personal story, and mm-hmm. that is always very interesting. So I wanted to ask you, who is your favorite saxophone player?
Saxophone player. Well, that's tough, but if I had to boil it down, there would be two. One would be an alto player named Cannonball Adderley, mm-hmm. and the other one would be a tenor saxophonist named John Coltrane.
Okay.
There are many, many others. It's hard to even isolate them. Yeah, there are so many, but if I had to pick favorites, those would be the two.
What do you learn from listening to them?
Cannonball is very soulful. It's hard to describe these things in words, but Cannonball has an element of gospel in his playing. He has an element of the blues. He is a stylistic innovator in terms of feel. I hope I'm not getting too vague to listeners, but it's hard to describe these things in words. But the way that Cannonball Adderley articulates, the way he plays certain notes is very, very unique, and it's very appealing to me. John Coltrane, kind of in the same way, but also he kind of took the technique of the saxophone to new heights and expanded the melodic / harmonic possibilities of improvisation. So he had a big impact, and he was a great composer as well. So a lot of his music is great to listen to.
Now, when you teach students, how can you tell that the student has it to become at least a very good sax player?
Well, sometimes it's not as apparent. Sometimes it's very obvious that a student has whatever it is, that there's an element. It usually takes a little bit of time to kind of coax out some things out of certain students. But when somebody really has it, that's apparent within 30 seconds, I would say.
What do you think is the most difficult thing to teach a student who wants to learn to play the saxophone?
Well, specifically saxophone, getting a good sound out of the instrument. The most difficult thing in general for all instruments, not just saxophone, is, and this is something that many musicians strive for, is to develop their own personal sound. And that is a very, very difficult thing for not everyone attains that. Some people sound like Cannonball Adderley their whole lives. They sound like a version of Cannonball Adderley. Some folks are very fortunate to where they can get to that level. That's not something that you can specifically teach, but that's something that I know that I personally guide students towards, is basically teaching them how to learn on their own. Because a lot of it is learning how to learn. Because a lot of self-discovery from improvisation and jazz, it's based on their, sitting in the woodshed and trying to come up with their own voice.
Well, thank you very much to Professor Jason Swagler, with whom we have an interesting conversation on saxophone. And next week, we're going to have Miss Gabriela Sanfier, a SIU student who recently visited Ireland in a study abroad experience, and she will be talking about that experience. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2013.